Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and my guest tonight is Jonathan Pelto. As some of you might remember, that Jonathan was a member of the Connecticut Assembly for 5 terms back from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, and then left and did a lot of other things for many years, and has been back in the news recently over the last few years because he's done a lot of research and education about education in the state of Connecticut. And he is currently collecting signatures to petition onto the Connecticut ballot for the gubernatorial race. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad to have you on. And I think a lot of people will be very interested in what you have to say about all the issues, but maybe particularly about education, because here in New London, it's a poor municipality, and like many of the other poor municipalities in Connecticut, are being very impacted by current Connecticut policies.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, I look forward, we can talk about a whole variety of issues where I think there's a growing unease among all kinds of people across the political spectrum that things are just they're not headed in the right direction. And whether you talk about education policy or tax policy or any variety of other policies, you're getting people getting more and more concerned. I mean, we have layoffs in hospitals that are completely unnecessary as the state and the federal government change policies that will make it virtually impossible for small hospitals to survive. We have a tax policy that coddles the rich and overburdens the middle class. And we have education policies that are taking Connecticut in absolutely the wrong direction. And New London is actually one of the ground zero points of that education. But because a lot of people don't understand that it's caught up in a much bigger battle, they just see what's happening to their schools right here and don't necessarily really understand how it's being driven by both federal and state policy. Education policy traditionally has been the responsibility of the local community, funded in part by the state government. And when we passed the income tax in 1991, one of the reasons that we said that we needed an income tax was to properly fund local education.
Because Connecticut traditionally pays a very small share compared to other states.
That's right. And the goal was to get it to what's called 50-50. 50% of the money would come from the state, 50% from the local property taxpayers on average. So in poor towns like New London or Norwich or New Haven, Hartford, what you would get is the state picking up a much larger share, and then because there's just not the tax resources to do a comprehensive school. Well, first under George W. Bush and then under President Obama, there was a federal policy that's really pushed towards, for all intents and purposes, privatizing education, particularly among urban education. So what the two administrations, one Republican, one Democrat, proposed was a system that basically rank orders every school in a state or in the country, and then as a matter of public policy takes the lowest performing schools and hands them to some kind of outside entity to run. So in New London, it was felt first with the concept of a special master. I mean, talk about a term that is out of the 1800s of how
it's
the
really
state of Connecticut.
It's really creepy to have a special master.
It is, and it's un-American. it's against the notion of local control. And this special master in particular, Stephen Adamowski, had just no respect for local control, local parents, local attitudes, multicultural education, bilingual education, and has been in the process of really dismantling the school systems he was in charge of. He was in charge of Wyndham and New London. They made enough of a stink in Wyndham that they pulled him out of Wyndham, sort of, and so now he's just playing with the future of New London. But over the last 3 years, I've really been looking deeply at this issue and have been going around presenting the evidence, because I think it's important that everybody understand just how much of a threat this is to the concept of universal, comprehensive public education.
And I think soon I'm going to hand it over to you to present that evidence. I just wanted to make the point that this reform group, they really have the rhetoric down pat that people, if they just listen to their words, would think, yes, this is what our schools need. And what they're doing is really not what they're saying. as an example, I saw an ad on Facebook. Click if you think all students deserve high-quality education. And if you click like, you were clicking like on Teach for America.
Right, right.
So the hype and the sloganeering and the reality are quite different. That's why I'm really happy you're here to give some factual background about where this came from and what it means.
Okay,
So-
let's do that. And it's exactly what you said. I mean, the people that are behind this effort are fundamentally approaching it from the corporate world. They're experienced, successful corporate executives, and they've learned that you can sell any product if you use the right words. And now they're selling us a bill of goods on education. I've got a PowerPoint that I'll just run through
Okay.
some of the slides. Not exactly sure how
Okay.
we get the first one up. There we go.
It's up there.
So the presentation, this is part of a broader presentation called The War on Public Education. And it really starts about 10, 15 years ago, as I said, really got going under George W. Bush and then dramatically expanded under Barack Obama. But I give credit to Rupert Murdoch, the media mogul, for at least being honest. Unlike some of the others who wrap themselves in the rhetoric, Rupert Murdoch doesn't have to wrap. I mean, he's too big to fail. He's so big he can actually tell the truth. And he said that when it comes to K through 12 education, we see a $500 billion sector.
So it's an untapped
market.
revenue source.
That's right. And what I think if we had them off the record, off camera, they would say that they realized in the 1950s that the military-industrial complex was an untapped market, that if you scared people enough, that the taxpayers would pay an unlimited amount of money to the private sector to create and maintain a war apparatus. And it's worth noting that the last speech that President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower gave, the speech before he left the White House to hand it over to John F. Kennedy, was to warn America about the military-industrial complex. It was back when there was some honesty within the Republican Party, and here was a Republican saying, beware, it's going to destroy this country financially and leave us isolated. And here we are, 70 years, 60 years later, and it's come to pass that our resources, that many of us work hard, pay our taxes, and instead of the money going towards vital services, it goes to feed a monster called the military-industrial complex. Well, I think what I describe is now this new rising corporate education reform industry, and that's what it is, and they are making huge amounts of money, and they're making it on public dollars. The first thing that they say is that public education is failing in America, and that the answer is to turn to the private sector, that let our schools be run by businesses, and they will run it with an efficiency that will provide children the education that they need. And most of us, or many of us hearing that would be suspicious right off the bat, but if you say something enough, if you lie enough, some people start to believe that it's true. One of the things that they say is that American public education is failing. We have a significant problem with public education in this country, and that is we have an achievement gap between those who have and those that have not. And every study done, every meaningful, realistic study done, shows that the achievement gap is driven by poverty, language barriers, and unmet special education needs. And that, in fact, if we were to deal with those issues, some of which schools can deal with, many of which schools cannot, we would close the achievement gap. But it's much easier for them to say, no, American public education is failing.
Right, rather than reducing the opportunity gap in order to reduce the achievement gap.
Exactly. And so what they say is the whole system is failing, just like we have to arm ourselves because everybody's out to get the United States when they were building the military-industrial complex. So the first thing you do is you scare people. In fact, in the United States, our test scores, and testing is not the best way to determine who's going to succeed and who's going to fail, but it's one of the mechanisms. Our test scores have never been higher. Our graduation rates have never been higher. Our school systems, in fact, are doing an extraordinarily good job. And you hear about how the United States is falling behind. But if you took the suburban children in New York, Connecticut and Massachusetts, they would score first, second, and third in the world. And so, in fact, the public school system, as we know it in most communities, is not only succeeding, but it's succeeding extraordinarily well. And we know that because the children are going to college. They may be left with crushing debt, but they're getting college degrees. Of course, they don't necessarily have jobs when they get out. But putting aside the notion of, can our children succeed, the answer is the public education system is working, except for this very significant problem. The second issue, what they do, and this chart is a little bit complex, people would have to go up to their TV screen to really look at it, so I'll describe it more than anything else. Before the Common Core test, starting about 20 years ago, there was a test called the NAEP, and it's conducted all over the country to be able to compare. People like Michelle Lee, who's the patron saint of the corporate education reform movement. She was Teach for America, and then she was given the job in Washington, D.C., and then she sort of burst onto the scene as the spokesperson for this corporatization of public education. And she puts out a scorecard or grade, and she put Louisiana as a B+ and Connecticut as a D-. She held Louisiana up as the state doing the best job, and Connecticut as one of the states doing the worst. So I went and I looked at the data, and what it shows, in fact, is that, and this is what these numbers are. This is at the NAEP, at the what's called the goal level. So 91% of white students in Connecticut are at goal. 83% of all of our children. Our lowest cohort, those are low-income or Latino English language learners, people who are who have to overcome a bunch of these barriers that stand in the way. They're at about 66, 67, 68%. Our lowest cohort does better than the average student in Louisiana. So the notion that Connecticut deserves a D- and Louisiana deserves a B+ is absurd. It's a lie.
Now, what's it based
it's untrue. Turns out that what it's based on is what they have are they've ranked all the laws to promote charter schools, privatizations, anti-union, where can people work without joining a union. And they couch it as they're grading public education. But what they're really grading is that Louisiana, in New Orleans, is the first major community to have done away with public education. 100% of the New Orleans school system is through charter schools. And so that is publicly funded, public dollars going to private corporations to run public schools. Arne Duncan, who's President Obama's Secretary of Education, is infamous for saying that Hurricane Katrina was the best thing that ever happened to New Orleans because it did away with the public school system. So they instead have been able to privatize 100% of the New Orleans schools. The privatization movement, which we just began to see in about 2012. We really don't have a lot of experience with it in Connecticut. There were a few charter schools before that, but now Connecticut is a major push to open more of these. But in Philadelphia, 40% of all of the students now public school students go to charter schools, that is privately run schools. Chicago, 40%. In Rahm Emanuel, who was Barack Obama's chief of staff, now mayor of Chicago, is 100% behind the privatization of public schools. So this is not one where we can easily say Republicans are bad, Democrats are good. It's very much an example of the incumbency party versus the non-incumbency party. But right off the bat, the notion that somehow Louisiana is beating Connecticut is so absurdly wrong, and yet that's what they keep on saying over and over again. So what really is going on? What really is going on is that we have this achievement gap, that the white students in Connecticut are at 91% a goal. I mean, we are doing exactly what we want our public schools to do. We're providing a comprehensive education that allows them to get into college, to live more fulfilling lives. They have art and music and PE, and they take a variety of different courses. And then we have our urban schools and our poverty schools in which children are facing real problems, and those problems are keeping them from succeeding in school. And as I said, schools can do some things, but they can't solve all of that. Connecticut was the first state in the country to have a commission that looked into children in poverty, and it was in 2001. And it set the goal of reducing poverty in Connecticut by 50% within a decade. A decade later, poverty in Connecticut had grown by 50%.
We've got one of the widest income gaps in the country,
That's right.
If not the widest.
We have the widest gap. And we have, and so when people say, well, we have the largest achievement gap when it comes to education, and the answer is that's correct. We also have the widest income gap. We're seeing unprecedented growth of poverty, particularly in our urban areas, but also in some of the rural areas here in eastern Connecticut. In Hartford, now 50% of the children are living in abject poverty. I mean, this is real federal definition of poverty. It is primarily African American, Latino, other non-white. Hartford, Connecticut is the poorest city of its size in the country. And now across the country, we've had a 60% increase in what's called high poverty schools. That is, schools in which significantly more than 50% live in, are growing up in poverty. So, of course, they don't do as well. They don't do as well for a whole variety of reasons linked to poverty, linked to language barriers, linked to unmet special education needs.
I'm thinking that in Connecticut it's exacerbated because we have so many different towns and so many different school systems. South of the Mason-Dixon line and in the west, a lot of school funding is on a county-wide basis. So the big cities still suffer, but small cities sometimes can share funding with more affluent suburbs. We
That's
don't
right.
have that option here.
And the answer in the long term is there has to be some more regionalization. It will have to be in the Connecticut fashion because, of course, the upside of local control is that parents and teachers and students have a voice. The downside is that then everybody wants to protect their town borders.
Yes.
And so we walk that line between how do we promote real regionalization. Magnet schools are one way to do it. We're going to have to do more of that and still allow for and provide for parents and students and others being heard. This next chart really shows just the difference between a wealthy town and a poor town of how they handle education. Bridgeport is not the poorest town. Westport, Simsbury are not the wealthiest towns, but they're up there. And what you see is that where Bridgeport spends $13,000 per student and has 98% of their children qualify for free or reduced lunch, that well over 10% don't speak English, 40% go home to households where English isn't spoken. And you compare that to a place like Simsbury, which is spending almost 50% more with no children, virtually no children having free lunch or reduced lunch, no children needing English language help, very few children going home, and all of the children having access to pre-K. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that if we underfund our urban schools and we rely primarily on the property tax, Simsbury ends up with an exceptionally good school system that can deal with those students who do have challenges. And Bridgeport, where you now have one of the policies that came into Bridgeport fairly recently, was we know, again, the studies are absolutely clear, that when you put a second adult in the classroom, it really helps, an instructional assistant that helps those children that are falling behind. In towns like Simsbury and Westport and in my town, every classroom has at least one, sometimes two adults in there to help special education students, to help students that are falling behind. Bridgeport, in part of its budget last year, did away with all instructional assistants in all of the schools.
In New London, the class size keeps going up. I think in elementary school level, it's capped at 28 now. A few years ago, it was 25. 10 years ago, it was more like 22 or 23.
That's right.
So you're seeing, and these are not necessarily teachers that have instructional assistants in their classes.
That's right. And so you put 28 or you put 30 in, and you have the breadth of issues and problems that come with poverty and language barriers, and you don't have anybody to provide that support. You get what you aren't paying for, and we know how to solve these problems. I mean, the one of the most stark and shocking factors is there actually, as more and more students are in need of English language skills or bilingual education, many of our districts, Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford, New London, are doing away with bilingual, either as a matter of budget or as a matter of policy. One of the federal policies is that you can only qualify for English language services for 2 grade levels and use federal funds. It was designed, I don't know if it was a Democratic or Republican proposal, but it was created in essence to stop immigrants from coming over, because the thought was that if you would only give their children 2 years of English language help, that either the children would learn faster or, I don't know, the immigrants would go back because they couldn't. So you lose the funding after 2 years. Well, in Connecticut, for example, most of the English language learners are not new immigrants. They're
Right.
second generation. So by the time kindergarten and first graders come along, they now cannot get the
Wow.
services that they need. So we start in Connecticut we start teaching science in 3rd grade, and we give them their first standardized tests in 5th grade. And you have increasing numbers of students who are now being taught science in a language they don't understand and tested in a language that they don't understand with no program to help them. Now we know
Right, and even if they know the language conversationally, it's different to know it academically.
that academically, or they go home to households where the language skills are not that strong, so that then they're not getting the support at home, and we wring our hands of saying, well, why aren't homes more supportive? Well, the homework is in English, the test is in English, the topic was in English, and we're not providing a mechanism so that parents want to help their children, but of course you've set up a system in which they're guaranteed to fail. And then they fail, and then we say, see, we told you so, when it was set up to fail. So this chart really gives people a sense of the difference between Simsbury has 11% of their children who have special education needs. Bridgeport has 12%. It's not that these children are not capable. It's that we're not providing the support services. So in Simsbury, when a child has special education needs, they're given, for example, and many special ed students are one-on-one or two-on-one, where you have an instructional assistant working with 2 students. In Bridgeport, the special ed classes are 12-1. So
That's a pretty scary ratio.
right. I mean, so you have 12 special ed students who are in need of help. If they lived in Simsbury, they would get 1 person helping 1 child. And in Bridgeport, it's 1 person helping 12 children. And so, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And why is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? And this is the prime example. So Hartford Milner School was a quote-unquote failing school. The city of Hartford revamped it a couple of times, like they tried in New London, and it was a failing school. It was a failing school, quote-unquote failing, because it had 100% of its students were poor. More than about 50% of the students were not English language proficient. It had the average number of special ed students. But because it was one of the lowest performing schools, under the system in which Bush, then Obama, now Governor Malloy has instituted, they want to shift those schools to a private company to run. And in this case, the Milner School was given to the Jamoki Academy. Jamoki is a charter school company in Hartford. It started in Hartford a few years ago. It had 1 charter school, opened for 6 years, and over those 6 years did not have a single bilingual student who had ever enrolled. And it had only 4% of its students were special ed, and those were very low-need special education students. Its director famously said at a legislative hearing that when asked, how is it that you have so few? You're supposed to be open to the community. Half your community is Latino. You have no Latino students. You have no bilingual students. You have virtually no special education students. And Michael Sharp, the director, said, we have a program where we go into the kindergartens and we cure students of their special education. Now, right there, they should have lost their charter, because, of course, the absurdity of that statement, the danger of a school administrator or somebody who pretends to be a school administrator, doesn't have any training or certification to be a school teacher, is saying that they cure kids of their special education needs. So what did the Malloy administration do? They took the Milner School and they gave it to the Jamoki School charter company to run. So all of the dollars, all of the tax dollars, everything went to this private company to run. Milner had 50% of their kids didn't speak English. They were given to a company that had never dealt with a non-English speaking student. Milner had more than 10% of its students who needed special education services. It was given over to somebody who denied that special education services even exist. I mean, it borders on being criminal, because in the sense that this company is now making a profit or making money at the taxpayer's expense to run a school in which they have absolutely no business. That was only 2 years ago. Since then, Jamoke Academy has been given a school in Bridgeport called the Dunbar Public School, local elementary school, to run. They were just given a new charter school in New Haven to run, and they got a contract from Louisiana to run a school in Baton Rouge, even though, again, they have no experience outside of Connecticut. And what we're seeing is that the growth of this education industry, where these companies that are primarily non-educators, and they have boards that are made up of corporate executives, are now running schools in which they deny the existence of things like poverty and language barriers and special education needs, the very things that we should be working on. And this is Governor Malloy's budget on education. He talks about himself being the education governor. This is probably the best example of what's happened. So the places that need the money, places like Bridgeport or East Hartford, Waterbury, New Britain, we could say New London would be on this list. Since he became governor, they all got an increase of about $250 per child. And the charter schools, these favored private companies, they got an increase of $2,200. So what they've been doing is, when you hear people say, well, we've increased funding for education, the fact is that the money is being diverted almost exclusively towards either the charter schools, or when they're given to public schools, they're given with such strings attached that it's like in New London, where the Board of Education no longer counts for anything.
Now, what happens to these students who are English language learners who go to schools like Jamoke Academy, where there's no experience dealing with them?
Right. I mean, because Connecticut is relatively new, we're just
don't
learning.
really totally know.
We don't really know. I mean, what we do know, and where we can look at the places that it's happened, because they often say things like, look at how we've improved test scores, and they point to their students who do proportionately better, slightly better on test scores. Well, the first thing you find out is that they have significantly fewer bilingual students, significantly fewer students who need special education, significantly fewer poor students. And how do they do that? Well, the first year, the second year, what they say is, well, your child really needs special education help. We don't have special education services here. So if you go back to that public school down the street, they will be able to help your child. Now, what's interesting about that argument is that not only does the state of Connecticut give the charter schools $11,000 per child, but we, the taxpayers, still pay all of the costs on top of that associated with transportation and special ed. But instead of providing special ed services, what they say to their families is, you do better in the public school. So if you look at what happens, they'll say, well, we have no students who drop out. And that's because when you leave a charter school, you're automatically enrolled in the public school. But if you look at how many children have left, charter schools lose 40, 50, 60% of their children over 4 years.
So it's not dropping out, but it is attrition.
It is attrition. It's being pushed out, and it's being pushed out back into the public school system. So they say, well, our test scores are better. Well, the reason that they're better is because you've pushed out all of the students who would arguably have needed services, aren't getting the services, and are then dragging your test scores down. So how is it that they do this? Well, you know, how is it that the legislators pass this? How does a governor propose something like this? So in 2012, Governor Malloy introduced, Governor Malloy, a Democrat, and I've been a Democrat all my life. I served as a Democratic legislator. I was in the leadership of the House of Representatives, left 20 years ago to raise a family and to run a small business, a number of small businesses. So I've been away from politics for quite a while. And during that time period, I've noticed, of course, that the Democratic Party ain't what it used to be. In fact, it's the incumbency party. It's hard to tell the difference between the two. The Democrats would like to say, well, the Republicans are bad and we're good. We heard it at the federal level,
Right.
we'll vote for the Democrats and we'll get out of these wars and we'll stop using drones and we'll tax people fairly. And of course, none of that happened. Same at the state level. So Dan Malloy introduced the most anti-teacher, anti-public education of any Democratic governor in the country. His bill proposed doing away with tenure, and it proposed doing away with collective bargaining for what these so-called turnaround schools, these schools that are being taken over. No Democrat in this country had proposed something that like that. The bill passed. It was watered down a little bit, but he got 95% of what he was looking for. And it turns out that the lobbying campaign for that bill was the most expensive lobbying campaign in Connecticut history.
Wow.
So when we think of lobbyists, we think of energy companies, we think of gas companies, we think of who are the people who really flex the power. Well, what's so interesting here in Connecticut, and this is just arriving in the last couple of years, is that now the single most expensive lobbying campaign in the history of Connecticut was to pass this guy's education reform bill. And you say, wow, why? And this chart, and for those, we can give out my website, but you look at it, and what you see is it's one reform front after another. Many of these are associated with national organizations, hedge fund managers, some of the corporate elite. In Connecticut, one of the biggest funders is the founder of Purdue Pharma, the company that produced OxyContin. He's one of the largest contributors. Another one is a guy named Steve Mandel. He's one of the state's true billionaires. He runs something called Lone Pine Hedge Fund. And these are people that this governor and others want to get close to. I mean, certainly there are probably viewers who remember that when Malloy passed his tax bill, it increased the income tax rate on everybody except for those making over $1 million. They were protected because...
Right, and yeah, there was a push to try to get a small surcharge on incomes over $1 million, and it went nowhere.
And went nowhere, because what Malloy said was that first off, he said he didn't want to punish success. Well, asking people to pay their fair share is about as basic American concept as we're supposed to have, that everybody needs to come to the table and pay their fair share. Our income tax rate on the wealthy is much lower than adjoining states. So the notion that if we started taxing wealthy people at a fair rate, they'd leave.
They're not going to go to Massachusetts or New York or New Jersey, that's for sure.
They're not going to go. And so they say, well, they'll go to Florida. Well, some people are going to go to Florida, mostly when they retire, because if you work on Wall Street, you're not going to commute from Florida. But what did we do? The Bridgewater, which is the largest hedge fund in the world, its CEO, a guy named Ray Dalio, is the highest paid American. He earned $2.3 billion last year as his pay. So Malloy and the legislature approved $120 million in tax breaks to Bridgewater so that they would move their headquarters from Westport, Connecticut to Stamford, Connecticut. So the argument was, well, maybe they would leave. Well, maybe they would leave, but $120 million of our money going to a company that could pay its CEO $2.3 billion, and meanwhile, we see our schools underfunded, our roads underfunded.
And we're seeing actually bidding wars between towns.
That's right, where they're saying, come. I mean, the one in the news now where Hartford is going to take the Rockets 14 miles. They're going to build a $60 million stadium. Malloy said that he wouldn't fund it, but the way that the funding system works is that Hartford would get most of the money from the state. So we're now using Connecticut taxpayers' money to move a stadium, to move a ball team from New Britain to Hartford, maybe, so that they'll be around for 2 years. I mean, there's nobody who knows the story better than people in the New London area, because we paid for Pfizer to come here.
Right.
They waited the 10 years they needed to. They took off. The New London tried to...
As soon as the abatements ran out, they left.
They left, and
the neighborhood that was flattened still has had zero development.
And all of that argument about how they were going to use the money and how they were going to use the eminent domain to take people's private property,
Yeah.
not for a public purpose, but for
No.
a private purpose.
And they did it.
And they did it, and then,
Yeah.
so the answer is, I mean, one
Yeah.
wants to be careful about being overly conspiratorial, but I don't think it's an accident that the most expensive lobbying effort. And one
It's
other.
been in the news recently that how much money Bill Gates has been giving to push Common Core.
That's right.
So that's along the same lines.
It's exactly along the same lines. There are three major foundations in the country that are pushing the Common Core and this education reform. It's the Gates Foundation, it's the Walton Foundation, which is the Walmart family, and it's the Broad Foundation, and he's a right-wing billionaire from Los Angeles. And when you go to Dan Malloy's campaign contributors, you find a $8,000 contribution from Eli Broad, this right-wing billionaire, just like you find a $20,000 contribution from this guy Steve Mandel, who is the Connecticut billionaire who's funding Teach for America. And just one last example on here. This shows that it's also not only at the state level but the local level. And it's not only New London that's being picked on, but this one happened in Bridgeport. The mayor of Bridgeport, Bill Finch, former state senator, Democrat, decided that he was going to propose just simply doing away with an elected board of education. Why even bother? Just have one that's appointed by the mayor. And that way we won't have to deal with all of the complaining of parents and unions and others and teachers. We'll just have an appointed. So he tried to change the charter. Interestingly, he was defeated by almost a 2-to-1 margin. So the people rose up and they said absolutely not. But it was the most expensive, to try to pass this, was the most expensive charter campaign in Connecticut history. Wow. So at the state level, we have the most expensive lobbying campaign in Connecticut history. At the local level, we have the most expensive charter revision campaign. And you look at the list of people. First off, there are these big organizations, but then, and it's in very small print, but I'll just read you a couple of them. Bridgeport Hospital, which was laying off people, managed to come up with the maximum allowable contribution of $14,000. The local water company, which has been increasing water bills, managed to come up with the largest contribution. The Harbor Yard Sports and Entertainment, they're the ones that's that Webster Bank Arena, which in this year's legislative session, many people will know that entertainment venues have to charge an extra 10% tax. So when you go and you buy a ticket to something, let's say it's a $10 ticket, they put on $1. If it's a $100 ticket, they put on an extra $10. There was in the last day of the legislative session, they snuck in an amendment that exempted the Webster Bank Arena from having to charge this 10%. So they'll now be in a position where they will be more successful than their area competitors because they managed to get this bill passed. Well, they came up with the maximum allowable. St. Vincent's Hospital, another hospital in Bridgeport that is on the verge of closing, came up with the maximum amount. So you look at this and you say, okay, so these companies that have a public purpose, that are under, that they get their money primarily from public resources, have a duty to the public, and yet they can come up with money to pay for a campaign to take away people's right to vote. And so normally you'd say, wait, this isn't. Sounds like something in Louisiana. It sounds like something in Texas. It sounds like something the teabaggers would do in Wisconsin. This isn't teabaggers in Wisconsin. This is Democrats in Connecticut, which is one of the reasons that I'm thinking very seriously about running for governor. I'm collecting the petitions necessary. People are responding by saying, don't be a spoiler. Well, as I was honored, humbled by the other day, Ralph Nader was on WNPR Where We Live, and he said Jonathan Pelto is not the spoiler. The two political parties are the spoilers for creating a system where people's voice can't be heard. And say what you want about Ralph Nader. Some people love him, some people hate him. When I was a child, I wanted to grow up to be like Ralph Nader or Martin Luther King or somebody like that. The fact is that our system is broken, and either we're going to take it back or we're not going to have a country that we can live comfortably, and certainly not a country that is taking care of the people in need. So this is sort of this is an example of what's happening, and it's happening across the board. This one just happens to be related to schools and education. as you know, because you have this show every week,
Yeah.
I mean, these problems are very real. They're growing. There was a day when I would say I was a believer in if we were making incremental growth in the right direction, incremental movement towards a better and just society, well, that was the way it was. You had to take small baby steps. Well, we're now taking giant steps in the wrong direction. And it means that Democrats, perhaps more than anybody else, have an obligation to say that's not the party that we belong to, and that either we're going to take it back or it can go off and do its thing, but we're no longer going to support it.
Well, more and more of these issues, I think, aren't really exactly left and right issues anymore. They're corporate and humanist, maybe.
Yep.
In New London, when we were fighting eminent domain use in Fort Trumbull, it was a weird alliance of progressives and libertarians. And I think more and more as the two major parties become so dependent on huge amounts of campaign donations, and the law allows them to do that, the rest of us kind of have to put aside some of our petty differences and just fight for people's right to be in charge.
Right. I mean, I think, and that's not to say that the
Right.
right wing is right on
Right.
things, and we're going to fight them on abortion.
Sure.
We're going to fight them on, these key issues. But I do think you're right. I wrote on my blog a couple of days ago that if I was elected, I would suspend and then repeal the Common Core. There's nothing wrong theoretically with having standards. Connecticut has very good standards. There's nothing wrong even with trying to align those standards with other states, although you lose the multicultural dynamic of, what is a set of standards in Connecticut may not be the right standards in Louisiana, or at the very least, they need to make their decision. We need to protect ours. We have very good standards in Connecticut. This idea of everybody having the same standards was really a stalking horse for this whole corporatization, because what they say then is, if you're going to have new standards, you're going to have new tests. You need new textbooks. You need new software for the tests. You need new computers.
And we're thinking market share opportunities
That's
now.
right. That's right. And anybody who speaks up becomes the enemy of what they're really the enemy of, is saying, why are we wasting all this money? But the way that the corporations have set it up is, well, then you're against education. And the answer is, I'm against education because I don't think we need to buy a whole bunch of new textbooks. We need to buy all new computers. We need to buy all new software. I'm not going to allow you to define the issue that way. But they've had a lot of success in other parts of the country of defining the issue, where if you're not for buying all of this stuff, then you're against education. And estimates are, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that it will cost to implement the Common Core in Connecticut, billions of dollars at the federal level. Now, if we were taking care of all of these issues, we could then have a discussion about, does it make sense to buy all new computers? We want children to have access to computers, but life is a lot more than simply learning how to type on a computer.
Now, I've just been told we have 5 minutes. So I want you to talk a little bit about your campaign. You have a running mate.
I do. I've announced a running mate. Her name is Ebony Murphy. She is a school teacher, a Connecticut certified school teacher, lives in Hartford. She is now working in a school in New York, which is and is headed back to Connecticut this week after school is out. It's an interesting thing that she ran into, and talk about other issues other than education. It comes back to education. Hartford, Connecticut signed a contract for another 220 Teach for America recruits. These are young people. It's a great opportunity. Good to have some young people come into our schools. But we have now hundreds of our children who are graduating from teacher education programs in Connecticut who can't get jobs in Connecticut. They've gone through, they've prepared to be teachers, they were trained, they took out the debt, and then instead of being able to have jobs, those jobs are being given to people who are coming in from out of state, who stick around for a year or 2 years. And so I wanted a teacher to be my running mate, an African-American, incredibly smart, articulate woman who can really address a lot of the issues that don't normally get addressed inside the Hall of Powers or in campaigns, plus somebody who has directly experienced this business of Connecticut residents going to Connecticut schools, borrowing money, learning what to be good at a job, and then no jobs. So she's my running mate. We'll spend the summer and fall crisscrossing Connecticut. We'll be talking about a lot of issues. The tax issue is a prime example. In Connecticut, the middle class pay about 10% of their money in state and local taxes. The wealthy pay about 5 or 6%. We adopted an income tax because we wanted a more progressive tax system. 20 years later, after the politicians are done with it, we now have a regressive tax structure. And it can change. It needs to change. Many of us can't afford the property tax increases that are taking place, and we're left with people saying, well, if you don't want to pay your property taxes, then we're not going to be able to fund our schools. And the answer is, I'm perfectly willing to pay my fair share, but it's not fair that the millionaire and those other people and the corporations are not. So we're going to talk about taxes, education, the environment, healthcare, a lot of important issues that just aren't getting the attention they deserve.
And right now, you need signatures, right?
That's right. That's right. And we're collecting signatures.
And maybe we can show people what the petitions look like, but yeah, you can talk about.
So any registered voter, Democrat, Republican, unaffiliated, can sign these. My website, jonathanpelto.com, JONATHANPELTO.com, will get you to an email address, and we can send you out some petitions if you'd like some to take around and get people to sign. We need 7,500 signatures. We're gonna run out of time, unfortunately, but the one thing that we've really learned is how the system is rigged to make sure the third-party candidates don't have an opportunity. Getting onto the ballot is not so hard, 7,500 signatures. But in order to qualify for a grant, you need 110,000. So we've got some real heavy lifting to do.
Right, and for that number of signatures, you don't even get the full grant.
No, you get a 1/3 grant. So they set up a system where the Republican and Malloy will each end up spending about $15 million. If we get 110,000 signatures, we'll get $2 million. But we'll put that $2 million to much better use than they'll put the $15 million.
Now, are you going to be anywhere speaking in the near future that people who want to see you in person?
Right.
Get to know you better?
It will be posted certainly on my website. Now that the campaign season is heating up, I hope that there will be some candidate debates. There'll certainly be opportunities to speak at different events. I'm starting to add some staff so that we can get ourselves organized. We recognize as a Herculean undertaking, but people will be hearing and seeing a lot more.
Well, thank you so much. If you want this viewpoint added to the debates, sign the petitions. I want to tell people in New London and New London area, I've got petitions if you want to sign or if you want to stack in a clipboard and instructions. So thank you, Jonathan, for coming on, and good luck.
Thank you.
Next week, our guest will be Josh Vincent, and he's going to talk about property taxation. He's coming up from Philadelphia. He's been working with the Connecticut legislature to try to figure out other ways to make property tax work better. So thank you again, Jonathan.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for coming.